Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and live from beautiful Charlottetown, I am Florence Ross, and welcome to the Charlottetown Guardian's 6th General Election Leaders Debate. This is an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in, where two visions of Canada will be presented tonight, an odd position for a Canadian debate. We had to choose to use a high polling threshold for this debate, thanks to the polling situation. Two large parties on either end of the spectrum lead over a pack of small candidates. It was a tough decision, but the smaller parties will have a debate opportunity tomorrow with the National. Mr. Cullen has given his protest to this decision, but we both talked and agreed to come together with the parties and press to formalize rules for future debates. Without further ado, we will have a 1-minute opening statement from each candidate. This was decided by coin toss, and Mr. Cullen will have the floor.
Thank you. Hello, my fellow Canadians. Here we are back again with yet another debate. I'd like to first off congratulate everyone in the last Parliament for coming together during the Unity Government and solving H5N1. Without the work of the Liberals, Conservatives, and New Democrats, we wouldn't be able to do that. And it's with that spirit of working together that we want to enter this next Parliament, moving forwards, not backwards. Forwards on expanding healthcare, not backwards. On a clean and green environment, on an economy that works for everyone, not just the rich and powerful, on fully universal post-secondary education with eliminating student debt and lowering the cost of living, putting more money back into the pockets of Canadians. That's what we're here to do today. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Cullen. Mr. Flynn, you now have the floor for a minute-long opening statement.
Thank you, Ms. Ross and Mr. Cullen, for joining us, and I echo Mr. Cullen's words on congratulating all the major parties for our compromise during the last Parliament. However, this election here is about stewardship and responsible leadership, not for control of Canada. The difference here is clear. The NDP wants to take control of the economy and your lives. We want to give you the tools to take charge and initiative for yourself. Government isn't above everyone else. We work alongside Canadians to cover all the bases while Canadians build up their lives honestly and fairly. We'll put dollars back in your pocket by scrapping the burdensome taxes the NDP has imposed on all Canadians. We'll restore the power to you to revitalize the economy, prevent layoffs, and create new jobs, because a free market is what drives economic growth and what drives prosperity for all Canadians.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Flynn. We are now going to be moving on to the meat of this debate. Candidates will get asked a question, then that candidate will have 1 minute to respond, and then there will be 2 minutes for the two candidates to freely debate with each other, and the moderator will reserve the right to intervene and also push if an answer is deemed vague. The candidates were aware of this beforehand. We're going to be starting off with a 2-question topic: foreign affairs. First question will be to Mr. Flynn. Your leadership is the most right-wing since Space Dude for the Conservatives. One of the controversies of that government was a hawkish stance towards China. Do you agree with this hawkish stance towards China? And if so, how is that not a dangerous footing to be on? You have 1 minute, go.
I think more than anything, our foreign policy needs to be dictated by reason and being pragmatic. And so, in government, my government will primarily aim not to take a hawkish stance towards China, but to build up relations with countries, with free, democratic, capitalist countries that can challenge China in building their global hegemony, so that freedom and capitalism can continue to make the world a safer and more prosperous place to be.
All right, thank you. We will now open the floor for 2 minutes of debate.
So, Mr. Flynn, do you have any specifics on China then? Because that was more about relations with other countries.
Sure, we will continue to try to work with China, but we will not tolerate China testing our boundaries and trying to get away with stuff such as espionage through Huawei. We will partner with fellow countries and allies where necessary to make sure China does not abuse their standing in the world to extract concessions from the West and from free countries. But we will not also pursue blind aggression or economic sanctions against China without extremely good reason.
So how can you say you're not going to take a hawkish stance toward China when then you call them a global hegemony? When you're saying they're
Because
creating
it's
an
the
empire.
truth.
That is a
Because
hawkish
it's the
stance to
truth.
take, though, and I'm not
The
disagreeing with you, but
hawkish,
that is a
the
level
hawkishness,
of hawkishism, if you will.
the hawkishness comes in on actually um, being aggressive towards China. We have no desire to be aggressive. We want to live in a world where China and other countries such as Canada can coexist as equals, but we will not tolerate China's attempts to surmount countries such as ours.
Can you give an attempt of them trying to surmount us?
Sure, by spying on us using Huawei.
No, okay. Anything else?
Them using their economic leverage to try to sway countries in Southeast Asia away from the West and towards them economically
And how do they do that?
by trapping these countries in debt and using predatory tactics, which a free market controls for.
A free market
All right.
controls for not trapping people
We
in
are
debt?
out of time for this, so thank you two for your stances. The next question goes to Mr. Cullen. Are you a free trade believer? If so, how do you balance out the damage that it can cause to certain workers in industries propped up by protectionist policies? And if not, what do you say to the economists that broadly agree that it is a net positive? You have 1 minute. Go.
Well, I don't explicitly believe in free trade, nor am I explicitly against it. It's a case by case basis, and that's what it comes down to. When you have countries of similar labor laws, environmental regulations, consumer protections, and health and safety laws, for example, free trade can work between the two of them. But when you see countries with starvation wages, sweatshop working conditions, zero environmental regulations, obviously we cannot compete with them because we care about our people. We care about our environment. We care about the average Canadian, whether they're making the product or buying it themselves. So when it comes to that, free trade is beneficial between countries that are similar in those areas of the law, and it can be damaging when it's in areas where there's complete imbalance between that. For example, in the European Union, it works because they have standardization of laws. So when we can see that, absolutely we can pursue it. But when we talk about competing with, again, starvation wages, I'm not going to ask Canadians to take a pay cut so we can add a few more jobs to the economy. That's not right.
The floor is
So
now open for 2 minutes.
Okay, so I'm glad to see that we're largely in agreement regarding what constitutes necessity for free trade versus necessity for protectionism. However, so as a result of this policy, will the Prime Minister, and if he continues to be Prime Minister, will he commit to working with us to pursue free trade deals with emerging blocs such as Mercosur and ASEAN that protect their workers and ensure that worker rights are protected, while so that Canadians and those countries are enriched in partnership?
Well, when we're talking about Mercosur, for example, in South America, that's countries like Brazil that have very little economic protections for their people and extremely poor environmental regulations. So right there, that's a disqualification. What we need to see is a harmonization of those laws and not us stooping down to their level. However, with that, and I'd hope you'd support me on this, something we tried to pass through the Smith minority government was the ratification of all trade deals by the House before they could be enacted. Now, that was shot down by the Conservatives, but would you, as now leader of the Conservative Party, vote for that and support that, giving the Canadian people a say, not just the executive?
Absolutely, government is responsible to the Parliament, and it's there's no reason that the elected representatives of the Canadian people should not have a say on where Canadian dollars flow and how free trade deals are made. However, with that in mind, I would also encourage him to ensure that regarding Mercosur, free trade deals would also include protections for workers in developing countries themselves, so that we can engage in true partnership instead of relationships of an exploitative
Gentlemen,
nature.
we are out of time for this question. We are going to be moving on to a 4-question topic, the economy. Mr. Flynn, healthcare reforms brought about by the NDP are quite extensive and well liked by many Canadians, but they are also expensive. Well, your plan for cutting taxes necessitates cutting these new programs. You have 1 minute, go. Mr. Flynn?
Oh, me. I thought you were asking Mr. Cullen. Okay. Absolutely. We will absolutely need to cut taxes to deal with these problems, and the fact of the matter is, healthcare is expensive, and Mr. Cullen's promises on healthcare are extremely expensive. We have our plans to ensure that healthcare is kept to the same exact standards as we currently hold them, and protect the Canadian healthcare workers, because they are the ones that guided us through the H5N1 crisis safely. But healthcare will remain a priority under a conservative government. But we will ensure that other policies, such as Nathan Cullen's disastrous Green New Deal, are the ones that are cut to make sure healthcare is not cut.
Thank you. I am now going to open the floor to Mr. Cullen.
Well, you talked about the cost there, Mr. Flynn, so I'm going to ask you a question. What's the bigger number, 18 or 30?
Why do you ask?
Well, because prior to the implementation of pharmacare, Canadians are spending $30 billion of their own money on prescription medication, whether through direct out-of-pocket expenses or through healthcare plans in their employment or purchasing private insurance on their own. However, now with pharmacare, the federal government spends $9 billion, the provinces combined spend $9 billion. So
Absolutely,
I'd like
and
to
that's
ask you,
because
what's the larger number there? What's
and
the
that's
bigger cost?
that's because the federal government has instead dictated to pharmaceutical companies what they can and can't sell drugs for, stifling innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, and making sure that new drugs and vaccines and other things that Canadians may need in the future may not be able to be developed at the same speed and efficiency.
So what about our pharmacare's plan with that exactly?
So currently, high costs are caused by out of control pharmaceutical companies because there is little competition in the market. Your plan further stifles competition in the market, but also reduces the operating margins of pharmaceutical companies, making it harder for those companies to operate when their compliance costs are so massive in dealing with your pharmacare plan.
What compliance costs are there? We bulk purchase generic prescription drugs based upon what we need. There's no compliance for that. They can choose to sell or not. That's their thing. We just unified Canada under a 37 million person single buyer system that gets massive efficiencies. You want to talk about government spending? That's how you reduce it, with a universal system. And if you're going to talk about money in people's
I'm
pockets,
sorry, we are
30
out of
billion
time.
back for 18 billion is a damn good deal.
We are out of time for this. Mr. Cullen, I have a similar question for your platform. We have already done major expansions to Canadian taxes, and yet you are promising more spending, particularly in healthcare. How do we pay for all of this without overburdening the Canadian taxpayer? You have 1 minute, go.
Well, when we talk about higher costs in healthcare, we have to realize they come with certain efficiencies. By covering prescription drugs, so previously to pharmacare, 25% of Canadians couldn't afford prescription drugs and weren't taking them. What that results in is more people going back to hospitals, going back to doctors, longer wait times, and higher healthcare costs for the provinces. So by implementing things like pharmacare and dental care, we're going to see increased savings in the healthcare industry. Now, how we've raised the funding for that as well is through by increasing corporate tax 3%. And you can ask any business professional out there, what would they rather do? Pay 3 cents more on the dollar of profit, or provide their employees with a comprehensive health plan on prescription drugs, mental health, dental, and vision? The case is pretty obvious. You'll take the reduced cost to run your business and pay a tiny bit more in profit while making far more profit.
Thank you. The floor is now open to Flynn for a 2-minute crossfire.
Okay, so in your platform, you promised to spend $8 billion more on mental, dental, and vision care for Canadians. That is almost 1/3 of what we already spend on the Canada Health Transfer. This is a massive increase, and it's not often an increase that corporation owners can afford, on top of the fact that you're also increasing the corporate tax rate, and you're burdening owners and investors with wealth taxes. How are they going to continue to invest in these companies when you are stifling them and preventing them from making their own economic decisions to invest in companies that are profitable?
Well, there's a lot in there, but I'm glad you mentioned us costing things, because pot calling the kettle black there, because we've got the costed platform, we've got the fiscal responsibility.
Well, the costed
You don't even know what percent of your taxes you're going to cut. You're saying we'll cut your taxes, and you don't even know what you're cutting it by.
But
Gentlemen,
the costed
please.
platform continues. Your costed platform continues to have inaccuracies. It continues to have wildly out there figures such as that 1/3 increase in healthcare spending. It is simply nothing more than virtue signaling on fiscal responsibility. What we know, what economic theory has proven, is that individual consumers make the best decisions in the economy instead of the government. We need less government control, not more. And your policies promise to put everything under the brow of the government.
Well, once again, under pharmacare, for example, if someone doesn't want to take a generic prescription drug, they're more than free to go buy their own for any brand they choose to buy. There's still that choice there. But once again, let's go back to it. You're going to make the claim that the Canadian people spend money better on healthcare than the government.
I am sorry. And gentlemen, may I please ask that you try to avoid yelling? So the next question is going to be towards Mr. Flynn. You want to continue pipeline construction, yet oil in Canada is becoming increasingly unprofitable. Is it really wise to subsidize and encourage a dying industry with these pipelines? You have 1 minute. Go.
I take issue with the question itself, because oil is absolutely not a dying industry. Just because Russia and Saudi Arabia are playing games with our oil does not mean that oil is any less necessary for Canadians. And this is the problem with the NDP's carbon tax that continues to burden Canadian consumers of all walks of life, because Canadian consumers need to use gasoline despite the NDP's failed quote-unquote free public transit plan that doesn't actually guarantee public transit and actually decreases the quality of public transit. What happens is, in rural Canada, in the bulk of Canadian suburbs and cities, public transit still isn't up to levels, and so consumers continue to rely on driving, and Canadian farmers continue to rely on gas-powered agricultural equipment, and that all costs more to operate, significantly more.
The floor is now open to Mr. Cullen.
Well, there was a lot of words there, to say the least. I'm honestly not sure what to say. If you want to continue, Mr. Flynn, you were in the middle of your sentence. I'll let you finish your thought.
Sure, absolutely. So this burdensome carbon tax continues. It's incredibly unpopular, and for a good reason. It is burdensome to consumers because they need gasoline to survive and to make a living in today's economy.
All right, you mind if I respond to that?
Sure, go ahead.
You can respond.
Average Canadian drives 15,200 kilometers a year at an average fuel economy of 8.9 liters per 100 kilometers, representing a total liters per year of 1,352. The carbon tax, or national price on pollution, whatever you want to call it, factors in a 0.6% or 6 cents on the liter tax, which the average Canadian at that amount per year is $81, and the rebate's $100. So we're going to talk about the price of gas, and they're actually making about $20 more at the end of the year than they'd be spending without it. That being said, in your platform, you refer to the oil industry as the largest job creator in Canada or something to that effect. Yet unemployment of young men in Alberta is 20% right now.
Sure, because of relentless attacks from you and past governments that have continued to attack the Canadian oil industry and made it unprofitable.
When did we drop the price of oil through the floor? Am I Saudi Arabia? Am I Russia?
No, but you
Because that's who's changing
you
the price
created
of oil.
you created burdens on oil producers by making those who consume oil having to pay more of their hard-earned dollars to the government for using oil that they often need.
But meanwhile, when the NDP had a carbon tax in Alberta for 4 years, price of oil was steady and jobs were being created.
All
Sure,
right,
because
gentlemen, we are out of time for this topic. Moving on to the next question. Mr. Collin, you are pushing for us to move beyond these fossil fuel industries. A few workers in these industries are old and nearing retirement. How do you expect them to enter into new industries?
Well, first off, we are increasing the old age transfer, the old age security benefit, by I believe $1.5 billion or $1 billion. I can quickly check my math on that. That'd be $1.5 billion. So first off, should they choose to retire, there will be more money in their retirement. But following that, with free, fully public, universal post-secondary education, what we're going to see is almost a zero cost to get an education, going back into college, learning a new trade if that's what you want. So affected workers absolutely have avenues to take it. But we're not sitting here and saying, shut it down. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying the price of oil is low. Let's get folks working in jobs that actually care about them, not the profits of a very few amount of shareholders and executive compensation, which, by the way, regardless of the price of oil, always stays high.
All right, Mr. Flynn, you can now enter in for a 2-minute crossfire.
okay, what is better for Canadians, having a job or not having a job?
Well, that's a simple answer, having a job. And when they get laid off because Suncor wants to protect their profits, they don't have a job.
Okay, so then why are you attacking Suncor and other oil companies through your carbon tax and other anti-oil measures when they consistently create jobs when not under such attack?
Well, regardless, once again, you agreed with
It's
me
not
that during the
regardless. This
NDP's
is an
carbon
important
tax
question.
in Alberta, jobs were created. So, first off, you're contradicting yourself. But second, let's think about that for a moment. You're sitting there saying this kills jobs and there's no job creation. Well, there isn't job creation in that industry right now. And the reason why we need to put a price on pollution is because climate change is real, it is man made, and it is going to have
Climate change
devastating
is
effects.
real.
And carbon taxes are proven to reduce emissions in Quebec
They
and
are also
BC
proven.
and
They are
worldwide.
also proven to burden the agricultural industry. They are proven to burden the oil industry. They are proven to burden the logistics industry. This has massive ripple effects, increasing prices on all consumer goods for Canadians throughout the country. And this is a burden on the economy. There are better ways of combating climate change.
Without fantasy technologies that don't work right now, like carbon capture? Can you name one?
Innovation is at the forefront of combating climate change. So what do you
Innovation
mean?
in what? How are we reducing our emissions? Because we've got set plans that not only
creating,
Gentlemen.
as the Conservatives promise, creating
Gentlemen.
the National Energy Corridor.
Gentlemen, we will be moving on to climate change later in this debate. The question is about jobs and re-employing people, so can you try to keep it on that?
well, the economy and environment are interlinked.
Yeah, they're all interlinked, and
I understand,
also
but it is my job to keep you on topic.
well, what's also interlinked is when people lose their jobs because of the NDP pushing a radical anti-oil agenda. What happens is prices
right.
for all Canadians increase.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. We are out of time for this topic. We're going to be moving on to the next topic of debate, character in a crisis. Mr. Collin, your party has been accused of blatant partisanship in the midst of a national health crisis. If Parliament is faced with another minority government, can Canadians really trust you to move towards other parties and compromise?
Did you miss the last government that was a national unity government, including New Democrats, Conservatives, and Liberals, that all came together to solve it? I mean, is this accusation about a specific issue
Well,
or a specific happening?
Well, this accusation has been leveled throughout as the unity government fell apart.
What do you mean the unity government? There was no unity in the government led by you
Mr. Flynn,
promising
Mr.
to
Flynn,
kick.
Mr. Flynn, you'll have a chance soon.
Well, he's not answering any questions now.
Well, I'm asking for more specifics on the question. You're sitting there saying I was going on my own, but I'm asking what did I do that was on my own?
Well, the questions address those accusations. If you think they're wrong, say why.
I absolutely think they're wrong. We worked with the conservatives to come up with a plan to solve the crisis. We integrated both conservative solutions and New Democrat solutions because they weren't partisan. They were just, hey, here's the problem. Let's get in there and solve it the best way we can. And that's what happened.
Okay, Mr. Flynn, you can now open up the floor to Crossfire.
Okay, you know what else you did, Mr. Cullen? You and your foreign minister put words in my mouth, put words in many Canadians' mouths when you promised to kick Turkey out of NATO, when you moved an amendment on behalf of the government to kick Turkey out of NATO, a massively disruptive and irresponsible move anyhow. And what happened is you betrayed Canadians when we promised Canadians that all parties would come to consensus before taking actions in the unity government. You betrayed this by unilaterally using your position, governing as if you had a majority, to try to push policies such as kicking Turkey out of NATO and trying to set a standard that countries you don't like that countries you don't like can't be in NATO.
So, Mr. Flynn, what you're saying is you don't believe we had a mandate to suggest that at all?
Absolutely not.
Well, to me, human rights are always part of Canada's mandate, and I'm not going to apologize for standing up to human rights abusers like Turkey. We are in a defensive alliance right now with them, and they are invading other countries, and I don't want Canada
and we're not
to
required
back them
to
up.
join. We're not required to back them up. NATO is a defensive alliance, as you said.
Absolutely.
And plus,
but what happens when after
and
they
plus,
attacked the
Turkey,
Russian aircraft
Turkey
there,
is
and
our
they step in?
Turkey is our biggest ally in the Middle East, fighting against much greater human rights abusers, such as the Islamic State terrorists, and such as the
what's an
government of
acceptable
Syria.
level of human rights abuse to you? Because the way they're treating the Turks to me seems like a human rights abuse, and I don't believe there's an inherent value to one human over another when it comes to literally their rights.
Yet the Amnesty International report found very, very little evidence to, and almost no evidence to suggest that Turkey was intentionally targeting Kurds in Syria.
They invaded the Kurdish part of Syria.
They invaded
That's a direct target of the land that they live on.
They invaded a Kurdish part of Syria that was under in civil war and was at risk of being captured by the Islamic State.
Gentlemen, we are going to be moving on now. Mr. Flynn, you left the unity government over an issue you agree with. How is this not a political stunt? You have 1 minute. Go.
I don't play games with democracy. I don't play games with the wishes of Canadians. So I absolutely don't appreciate when parties in minority standing try to use their status as prime minister and foreign minister to pull such stunts. Canadians did not vote the NDP into a majority government. Instead, the Conservatives and Liberals together formed a majority, and the Conservatives and Liberals both stood in firm opposition to the amendment moved by the NDP, and yet the NDP continued to double down on it in official government statements. This is what partisan stunts are like, not pulling out of a unity government that actually is farcical for unity.
Mr. Cullen, you have the floor to initiate Crossfire.
Well, first off, I'm glad Mr. Flynn brings up the Conservatives and Liberals working together, and if he's so proud of that work, is he also proud of the Conservatives' actual lies of saying, hey, we're going to scrap the carbon tax, and then not only, in order to get power, not only going, hey, we're going to keep it, but we're going to increase it. So on what standing, if you're going to talk about the work you did with the Liberals, do you have to say you're going to cut the carbon tax? Is it just trust us again? This time we really mean it?
Perhaps the NDP doesn't know the meaning of multipartisanship and compromise when they see it, because as we saw in the last unity government, all they know is pushing their own harmful agendas if they run the show. But in a democracy, you sometimes have to put government stability and the public good ahead of your individual beliefs. Canadians did not elect Conservatives to a majority because the Conservatives did not put a viable alternative forward to the NDP's destructive carbon tax agenda. But this election, that's changed. We're putting forward a plan that works for Canadians and keeps Canadians in business and puts more money back in Canadians' pocket.
The last Conservative Party had a plan to make up for the revenue lost by the carbon tax. What's your plan for that?
ending the disastrous Green New Deal that you've started that doesn't actually work.
So you're going to scrap over $30 billion in job-creating investment.
It's not job-creating investment, it's tax and spend policies that you continue to push that just constitute a tax on hardworking Canadians' jobs.
Infrastructure projects are job-creating? Because infrastructure projects are involved in that. $2 billion in manufacturing rebates for green manufacturing is part of that. Those all create jobs.
But rebates are not the bulk of your spending. The spending
Gentlemen,
is the
we
problem.
are out of time for this topic. We are going to be moving on. You'll probably be pleased to know it's a climate change. Mr. Cullen, oil is a major part of Canada's export and domestic economy, yet Canadian oil producers are currently struggling thanks to low oil prices. Mr. Cullen, should we bail out the oil sands and the Canadian oil industry in general? And if not, what is your plan for those workers?
Well, seeing as Mr. Flynn loves it so much, surely he would agree that any bailout of any industry should come with equity stake, as anything else in the free economy in a private market would work. We're going to explore the nationalization of the oil industry. It's high time that Canada's natural resources were owned by Canadians, not a few companies that give outrageous billions of dollars to a few shareholders. Everyone in this country should benefit from the bounty of natural resources we have. So if there's any money going to the oil industry, it is to buy it up for the people. And if we're going to do that, we're going to do that by working directly with Alberta and Saskatchewan to make sure they're on board with it. Because if they're not, we're not going to do it.
Thank you. Mr. Flynn, you now have the floor for 2 minutes of crossfire.
Okay, so what happened when countries such as Mexico, Venezuela, Russia all nationalized their oil industries?
Didn't you also just blame Russia for having a stronger oil industry than us that's collapsing our price, though?
No, it's
I'm not defending the economic policies of the oligarchy that is Russia. But let's look at Norway. Norway has a publicly run, publicly owned oil company called Statoil, or Equinor now, I believe.
But it's not competitive.
Well, despite the fact that it makes a profit, yeah, it's not competitive, and ignoring the trillion-dollar sovereign wealth fund they have. On what basis are you making that accusation? And right now, Canadian oil also isn't competitive due to global oil prices. We don't have Texas crude. We have dirty oil sands oil that takes a hell of a lot more to refine.
Yes, it's because of pipelines that you have consistently fought against in government that Canadian oil is not competitive. Because you failed to authorize pipelines that Canadians have been pushing.
What pipeline did I not authorize?
Basically all the pipelines that.
Just all of them.
Yes.
Alrighty then. That's just the furthest I've seen the Conservative Party go from anything resembling the facts. But that being said, let's talk about pipelines, if that's what you want to talk about. With their National Pipeline Safety Plan, do you believe companies who build pipelines should be responsible for the spills?
They should be responsible for making sure the spills don't happen, and if they don't do their due diligence, if they don't do their due diligence, then they should be responsible for the fallout.
So do you agree with our National Pipeline Safety Plan that makes them directly responsible before a spill happens, so that we don't have to worry if they're feeling nice enough to clean it up?
We should absolutely make them responsible for cleaning it up, and I'm sure that your policy can be improved in some way. I'm sure it many good aspects to it.
Do you know any
All
of the
right,
policies
gentlemen.
I'm talking about right now?
Gentlemen, we are out of time, unfortunately, for this question. Mr. Flynn, is climate change a serious issue, and is there a place for government in the response to climate change? You have 1 minute, go.
This is a broad question to cover in 1 minute, but I'll try to do it justice. Climate change is absolutely real and human-made, and the good thing is, climate change can be dealt with without a complete restructuring of the Canadian economy. Canadian natural gas is some of the cleanest burning out there, and through the Conservative plan, we're going to help subsidize bringing this to throughout the whole world and making liquefied natural gas a new standard transitionary to cleaner sources of energy. And so our primary goals to combat climate change are to encourage consumers through tax credits to undertake behaviors that will massively reduce carbon emissions from our homes. Our national energy corridor will connect hydroelectric energy from Ontario and Quebec to the rest of the country, making sure that clean energy is available nationwide for those Canadians who wish to avail themselves of
Mr.
it.
Cullen, you can now enter in for Crossfire.
All right, so you said to Quebec, but Quebec doesn't want a pipeline. They've made
Quebec
that
doesn't-
very clear. So
Our
are you forcing
our national energy
pipeline?
corridor isn't a pipeline. It's
They
not
don't
a
want
pipeline.
any new ones. Wait,
You
sorry.
don't know what you're talking about. The national energy corridor is not a pipeline.
What exactly is it then? Because I heard pipelines
It
in
is-
there, and
It's energy infrastructure to connect hydroelectric plants in Quebec with which produce excess output with households across the country and businesses across the country that could benefit from having cleaner energy that doesn't have to burn and release carbon into the atmosphere.
yeah, and part of the Green New Deal was $1.5 billion of that per year to completely connect all grids in Canada and modernize them. So you're going to scrap that, but now you trust us, we're doing it in a conservative way. It's got blue paint on it this time, so it works?
No, because the Green New Deal's plan isn't like half-baked and doesn't actually get the job done, and this is why. Because in the Green New Deal, simply by hooking up grids doesn't mean that you have a nationwide working energy corridor. What happens with hooked up grids is you continue to suffer from voltage drops and under your plan, you make no contingency for making sure that transport of energy between areas is actually reliable.
So I have to personally go and test all the lines. What's the difference between increasing the amount of interlink between Ontario's grid and Quebec's grid versus your plan? What are you doing differently then? Let's differentiate here.
Because we're like specifically creating for transformers and voltage manipulators that will make sure that energy can reach anywhere in the country fast and efficiently.
Gentlemen, thank you for that. Mr. Cullen, the next question is to you. Several countries are falling behind on pollution targets. Canada is only a small part of the global pollution system. How will you pressure countries to help meet pollution targets? You have 1 minute. Go.
Well, first off, I'd like to say the argument that we only produce a small amount relative to the world production is a extremely childish one. It's going, someone else made a bigger mess than us, so let's not clean up ours. We got to lead by example. So that's the first thing. By creating a green economy that absolutely works, we are becoming a world leader and showing countries there is actually a way. We're giving them that better alternative directly in front of them. Following that, we want to get Mexico in on a carbon price. We want to get them on our standard, bringing it up and making them less competitive compared to us. And following that, we want to move all foreign aid behind climate goals. We want to restructure that because it's completely unfair to go to a developing country that was ravaged by colonialism and corporate colonialism that's completely stripped it of its abilities. We don't want to go and say, gee, sorry, you can't have good power. Sorry, you can't use a coal-fired power plant. Too bad. We want to say, hey, here's some money to get you green power. Let's get you doing things the right way and be a partner instead of this force that's twisting everyone's arm to do what we want.
Mr. Flynn, Crossfire.
Okay, so Mr. Cullen, is China implementing carbon tax anytime soon?
No, they're not. Not
Is India?
Knowledge. Not to my knowledge.
Okay, so when you're so eager to flex your diplomatic muscle against Turkey for alleged human rights violations that multiple human rights organizations have classified as largely untrue, how can you continue to justify attacking us on supposed hawkish policies regarding China? And how can you continue to be claim your policy in line with the facts and consistent when basically you burden Canadian consumers while not actually substantially chipping away at global carbon emissions?
Well, it's about personal responsibility. We have to solve our issues
Then
at home
shouldn't
before we
Canadians
tell
have the
anyone
freedom
else.
to take responsibility instead of
They
the
are
government
by
forcing
voting
it
for
down
an
their
MDP
throats?
government, as we won a
Instead of the
majority in our
government
first
forcing
term
them down
and a
their
plurality
throats.
of votes in the last election. Climate change and climate change policies are absolutely popular. That's a fact. There's polling to back that up.
And there's
And offering a
responsible
few
and
tax
irresponsible
credits
ways to
while
do that,
forcing
and the
people to pay
conservative
more
plan
for
is
public
the only
transit
responsible.
does
Gentlemen,
nothing.
can you not talk over each other?
But if we want to talk about hawkish policies on China, I'd like to remind everybody that it was the Conservative Party that falsely claimed an attack on a Canadian ship from China. So
This was following American. It was following faulty information from the Americans. Or what if you get faulty?
A moment to think about it, it was jumping the gun. That's an Article 5 of NATO right there. That's war. That is World War. Not taking a moment to think,
And
just jumping into it because it's anti-China and fits our mantra. That's ridiculous.
it's
And
not
yeah, we
ridiculous
cannot
to
force
it's
China
not
to have a
ridiculous
carbon
to
price, but we
assume
can work
it's
with the
not
developing
ridiculous
world.
to assume
Gentlemen.
that our allies are taking their due diligence.
We're really going to claim America's doing their best right now?
All right, we are
We
out of
thought they were.
time. We are out of time for this topic. Mr. Flynn, how businesses thrive on stability. Recently, we've had both the Green New Deal and carbon tax, which you oppose. How does this cycle of pass and repeal not create an unstable environment for Canadian businesses? You have 1 minute. Go.
I'll tell you what creates an unstable environment for Canadian businesses. Relentless attacks from the NDP and from the government, which wants to push obstructive agenda down their throats. What we will do in the Conservative Party is restore stability by instead giving them the choice and giving them tax incentives to do environmentally stable and sustainable policies, while avoiding policies such as the NDP's incredibly unpopular carbon tax that avoiding policies such as the NDP's incredibly unpopular carbon tax, which continue to disrupt. Now, we can't guarantee what future governments will do, but we'll make sure that solving climate change gets done without depressing the Canadian economy and forcing this recession that we're now in to be worse, to cause layoffs and job losses for Canadians and price increases to go with it, making living in Canada without the assistance of government programs harder.
Mr. Cullen, you are now open to crossfire.
So you're talking about tax rebates and credits here. Give me a dollar amount of any single one of them because you've got none in your platform.
This is we've got none in our platform because we believe that through negotiating with these businesses and through finding a dollar amount that works in our budget later is preferable to us spitting out a number now that's not going to actually come to fruition or that's not going to be effective. What the NDP has done is promise numbers that don't necessarily work, that simply promise the surplus the NDP wants to claim they're running for fiscal responsibility. I'll tell you what fiscal responsibility is. Fiscal responsibility is avoiding the tax and spend policies that caused the stagflation oil crisis in the 1980s and that are going to cause another crisis today if you and the and your party don't stop down the irresponsible path you're taking.
If you want to talk about efficiencies, a simple "I don't know" would have worked for that. But that being said,
it's not. I don't know. We'll do our due diligence and we'll do our
Mr. Flynn,
research.
let him talk.
Unlike you.
You claim the carbon tax is this massively unpopular policy, but yet last election, 60% of Canadians voted for parties that not only wanted to keep it, but increasing it, with the Conservative Party eventually agreeing. So what are you citing for unpopularity?
And only
because 60% of the voters say it is popular.
Only BC, Quebec, and certain provinces in the Atlantic are ruled by governments that even support the carbon tax. These governments arose in direct opposition to a carbon tax, and we will stand by these governments. Refuse to be bullied by the NDP's agenda.
Well, Ontario and Alberta both had carbon pricing in place, and had they kept it, they would have been allowed to keep it as BC.
And they got rid of it because it was unpopular.
Gentlemen, we are out of time for this question. We are going to be moving on to social issues. There will be 4 questions here. Mr. Cullen, your campaign is pushing for a push to rehabilitation and criminal justice. Many Canadian families are victims of crime, murder, etc. Many of them do not think justice is a murderer getting out of prison. If your family became the victim of a violent crime, would a criminal being released after the state determines them to have been redeemed be real justice? You have 1 minute. Go.
Well, first off, when you say many Canadian families, that sounds like a majority of families suffer violent crimes, which is just not true. We live in an incredibly peaceful society. And how we keep a society peaceful is by not saying, all right, anyone who does something bad, we're locking it up. It's admitting that people do wrong things, whether it is something absolutely disgusting and terrible like murder or something much less sinister. People do the wrong thing. But sticking them in prison and then kicking them out after 20 years and going, all right, don't do it again, does nothing to stop them from committing yet another crime. Rehabilitation is proven to reduce the amount of recidivism. I think I pronounced that correctly.
Recidivism.
And it works. We've seen that time and time again. Sitting there and with tough on crime policies and putting your hands up and going, yeah, we sure stuck it to them, doesn't stop crime from happening, and it doesn't prevent it from happening in the future. Rehabilitation is the only way forward with that. And that's why we're not just having it where some bureaucrat goes, all right, you check the box, we're good. That's why we want to plan to help integrate prisoners back into society by using something akin to a social
Mr.
worker, saying,
Flynn?
hey,
Mr. Flynn,
Okay,
you
so-
can crossfire.
So you claim that these policies reduce recidivism, but that's simply not true, because as we've seen, when Canadians are released for homicide, 38.9% of offenders reoffend, including 20.6 who commit violent crimes. So how can we feel safe releasing people under the guise of rehabilitation when they're just going to when it's possible that they're just going to reoffend, and when they've already committed a crime, knowing full well through mens rea that their crime could land them in jail and directly violates the law?
So, first, I'd like to say, where are your statistics on that? What are they coming from? I'd just like to see a source on that.
From the University of Saskatchewan here.
University of Saskatchewan. A large study done by them. Is it a landmark study? Is it popularly cited?
It's a professor of It's from Professor of Psychiatry in the University of Saskatchewan.
Alrighty, well, we can look into that because I haven't read that study. If you're going to make a claim, I want to see the numbers. But anyways, that being said, what's going to stop someone from committing crime when they get out of jail? Is it going, all right, you've just spent the last, let's say, 10 years in a completely different society, in a completely different system. Now go out there. It's going to be harder for you to find a job. It's going to be harder to find a place to rent. You're not going to have any money. So just go out there. And by the way, don't commit any more crimes. Crime comes from socioeconomic conditions. It doesn't come from a person going, I'm weighing the options carefully, and I think this is the right thing. You want people to stop committing crimes? You got to teach them. You got to show them there is a better way and give them that better way. That means through community programs such as community policing or increased after-school activities.
But then if you continue to push the idea that crime is caused by socioeconomic conditions, I absolutely agree. But then why are you continuing to push these policies that will worsen the recession and drive more people to crime instead of putting more money back in their pockets by decreasing depressive taxes?
Gentlemen, we are out of time for this topic.
Because he just said I am raising crime.
No, I'm saying you're worsening the economy, which indirectly raises crime.
We are going to be moving on. Mr. Flynn, the rightward turn in the CPC has some minority groups concerned. With the memory of the Space Dude government's push against C-16, the landmark bill that expanded the Human Rights Act for trans and non-binary people, are transgender Canadians the gender they say they are? And is it gender identity, not sex, that should be the protected class under the Canada Human Rights Act? You have 1 minute. Go.
I absolutely think both gender identity and sex should be protected under the Canada Human Rights Act. Research has shown us in recent years that gender and sex are completely different, and though there is a strong correlation between them, it is not necessarily causative as a relationship. We do not believe that we stand strongly behind all LGBTQ individuals, which is why conservative government will take steps to ensure that LGBTQ individuals are prioritized for refugee resettlement, for example. This demonstrates our commitment to the issue. And what will happen is we believe that protected classes, as far as protected classes go, LGBTQ plus individuals absolutely fall under that banner.
All right, thank you, Mr. Cullen. You can now crossfire. Go.
There's nothing to crossfire, and I believe we're in agreement there. A person should not be persecuted for their gender or their sex, regardless of what it is, or their sexual orientation. I think that the fact that there are people in this country that believe that's a legitimate reason to discriminate, such as former conservatives, is rather disgusting. We need to be a nation that takes pride in ourselves and who we are, and if that's who you are, that's totally okay. Doesn't matter, like, that shouldn't factor in anything, and the fact that we need laws to protect that is ridiculous, but it's what we need, and they've got to be there. So there's no disagreement here, and I look forward to working on that in the next parliament.
One thing, though, please don't pin this on the conservatives. Conservatives, liberals, and NDP people before now all have held rather backwards ideas regarding gender identity and
Tommy
sex.
Douglas had horrible views on the LGBT community. It's
exactly.
Just that
So don't pin this as
to get the
something.
message about 20 to 30 years
so
before
then
the
don't.
conservatives.
So then don't pin this on just the conservatives. It's something
your last
that
government, though.
It's something that the research has been relatively recent on, and we're making sure that we are up to the times.
Do you need research to show you what's morally right? Do you not have like a innate moral compass there to tell you, hey, we shouldn't be discriminating? Only if the research tells us it's okay.
But conservatives and NDP people alike in the past did not necessarily agree with us.
But there's a difference between the 1960s
we should be glad.
2010.
Now we should be glad that today we are all in agreement on this issue instead of trying to play it up for partisan points. Canadians don't appreciate that.
Well, that's understandable, but the question was about your last time in government, and that's exactly what your party did. Like, you have to own up to that.
No,
I owned up to... How many decades ago was Tommy Douglas? I owned up to his bigotry on that subject.
I wasn't in the past government, but
I wasn't alive in the 60s. But I can take responsibility for what my organization did at the time.
Gentlemen,
so I'm glad we recognized that
we're sadly out of time, though. Mr. Cullen, if it came out that a left-wing provincial government was hurting or otherwise committing acts against Indigenous communities of Canada, would your federal government step in to protect Indigenous rights? You have 1 minute. Go.
Regardless of political orientation, absolute. The fact of the matter is, they are people and they're humans. They have human rights. And anytime, irregardless of whether it's federal government, a provincial government, or even a municipal government, or a foreign government tramples on human rights, we need to be there. And especially given the context of previous relations between the Indigenous people and the Canadian government, we have to be there so much more than we currently are, and we need to keep pushing that. So, irregardless of the government, absolutely.
Thank you. There will now be 2 minutes for free discussion.
Okay, so why is your government continuing to oppose Indigenous communities that want pipelines that are economically beneficial to them built through their territories?
Once again, what pipeline have we shut down? What pipeline have we not okayed? All of them isn't a valid answer, by the way. That's not prepared for debate.
Then tell me which ones you have.
We haven't approved any, but we haven't disapproved of any either. What pipeline project has there been during my time in office?
Many pipeline projects have been under consideration for years and years, and the Trudeau government failed to approve them, and now your government has failed to change anything about that because
what party was in between Justin Trudeau and me? Who was prime minister between those?
Sure, multiple switches between the NDP and the Conservatives, but here we are finally taking action on this issue that your government has failed to do.
Is that taking action on the issue same as how you guys promised to cut the carbon tax and scrap it last time and then totally flipped on that?
Once again,
you're just saying, we don't do it, but trust us, we're going to do it this time.
Once again, I don't think Mr. Cullen knows the meaning of compromise, which is especially concerning considering that we are headed to a government which all polls show will be a likely minority government, because Mr. Cullen can't compromise, because Mr. Cullen doesn't know the meaning of compromise, including possibly waiting on policies to reduce or abandon the carbon tax, in order to get a stable government that can combat the issues of the time without heading to another election.
And we saw how stable that government was. How long did that last again?
Because you played partisan games with the unity government that came after it.
Partisan games was liberal and conservative members rejecting that unholy union?
It was the...
Gentlemen, I am sorry, we are out of time here. Last question in the socialist use. Mr. Flynn, euthanasia is one of the social fights that has dominated Canada recently. The right, established in Carter v. Canada, was a landmark Supreme Court case. But opponents of the Trudeau Bill C-14, passed in 2016, say that the government narrowed the Carter rights. Do you personally agree with the Carter decision, and should C-14 be expanded?
I absolutely believe that in a democracy we must respect the ruling of the Supreme Court, and I don't believe that the debate on whether I agree or disagree with the Carter decision is ultimately fruitful. However, what I can say is that regarding specifically C-14, the Trudeau bill did go beyond the scope of the ruling, and did also allow for more exemptions than the Carter ruling actually allowed for. And so we want to protect life first, and although we will not go against the Supreme Court's ruling, we will also not allow, for example, vulnerable people to be exploited and induced to take their own lives.
Thank you. Mr. Cullen, you can join in.
If I could tell a personal story here, and it's going to be a little bit emotional for me, it's why I support doctor-assisted suicide. So when I was 10 years old, we had a Thanksgiving dinner at my family's house, and we had our cousins from our town over and our cousins from the United States. They came up, and this was at the time that my grandfather was still with us. And that Thanksgiving, he had spent the day before with us, and he wasn't sure he was going to come to dinner. He said he was feeling tired. And my uncle was, no, you don't get to skip Thanksgiving dinner. You're coming up here. You're seeing your grandkids. You're coming here. And so he brought him there, and we had a wonderful Thanksgiving meal with him. He was able to see all of his family, enjoy cold beer and some great turkey. And then shortly afterwards, he passed away at that dinner. And for a long time, it was very troubling to me because he passed away in front of me. But looking back on it as an adult now, my grandfather got to spend the last minutes of his life surrounded by the ones he loves with a good meal and cold beer. And I mean, honestly, everyone should have that opportunity. At certain stages of life, there is no quality of life. And should someone want to exercise their right to bow out gracefully and enjoy that last meal with their family and loved ones, they absolutely should have that. Thank you.
Okay, I absolutely empathize with the situation Mr. Cullen was in, because very recently my own grandmother passed away very far from me, and I was not able to see her as she was in the hospital. I was not able to contact her through her terminal illness, and so I absolutely know that having such an opportunity might give families emotional closure. However, one thing I just want to make sure, and I absolutely hope that Mr. Cullen can join me in this, is that that terminal illness and making sure people can die. People can die surrounded by their loved ones and get that closure. This should be the main factor. But unfortunately, there continue to be cases of people being exploited, and families trying to get rid of relatives with illnesses because they don't want to bear economic.
Mr. Flynn, we are out of time.
So can I finish just to ask for unity between us? So can we agree?
Is there unity with you two?
So can you cite to me a case of someone having their grandfather bumped off because they didn't want to see him anymore?
It's happened.
Because there are
Can
safeguards
we
there to
can we
protect
agree? Can
against
we
that.
agree? Okay, so we're in agreement then. Glad to see that.
All right. We are moving on to a final topic. This is more miscellaneous. There are 2 questions left, one for each candidate. So, Mr. Collin, the Unity government mandated to the provinces policy changes as part of its H5N1 response. This was done at the pushing of you and the NDP. How does this not represent a flip-flop from the previous NDP/LDA stance of fighting for the rights of Quebec and other provinces during the Space Dude era? You have 1 minute. Go.
Well, let's look at what we pushed for. We pushed for expanded sick days during a healthcare crisis, and temporary ones at that. And did I go to the province, go to Doug Ford and say, hey, do this? No, I had a conservative minister of interprovincial affairs right there to back me up. Adrian Nim agreed with that policy, and we implemented it, and that's what happened. It was temporary to just ensure that people had the sick days they need, and the provinces are more than welcome. I would urge them not to, as it's the decent human thing to do to give people sick days, but should they feel that's the best decision, they're capable of doing it. They're taking it away.
Thank you. Mr. Flynn, you can join in for a 2-minute crossfire.
Okay. I just have a quick sort of expansion on that. So we agreed that. So I'm glad we can agree that expanding sick days during crisis is the responsible and humane thing to do. So are we in agreement that regardless of which party is elected to be the biggest party and which party eventually forms government, we will create, as the conservative platform says, a crisis response plan that allows for automatic government implementation without legislation of such measures?
I'm absolutely open to that, but my problem is what happens when a government decides that there's a crisis without there being one. So there would have to be very strong controls on that, multiple checks and balances on that plan, and I would want the provinces to agree as well, because if they're going to start giving up what's constitutionally theirs in the situation of a crisis, but not with explicit definitions on what that crisis is or what the measure is for it, that's a very slippery slope.
Okay, glad to see we agree on that. I don't think there's much to challenge on that.
No, it makes sense to me.
Okay, if there is nothing else to add, then we can move on. Mr. Flynn, the Unity government passed...
Hold up. Somehow I got moved to general. Can you repeat what you just said?
Okay, sorry. Mr. Flynn, the Unity government passed border control measures at the pushing of the Conservative Party. Are you going to continue these border control measures, or was that just a temporary response to the emergency? You have 1 minute. Go.
It was absolutely a temporary response to the emergency, and such border control measures are simply to make sure that we did not, the disease did not...
Mr. Flynn?
Other countries in Canada.
I'm sorry,
Can
can you repeat that? You had cut out there.
Oh, from the beginning?
Sure.
Okay, absolutely they're temporary. There are temporary measures specifically to make sure that Canadians and other foreign nationals don't bring viruses from abroad to Canada, and it would be part of such an emergency response plan that I hope we can work with other parties to pass. So what happens is this is only necessary in times of a crisis such as these, and it used and it will be immediately deactivated as the bill has provisions to do so by ordering council.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Collin, you can join in for 2 minutes of crossfire.
Well, as long as it's medically necessary and it's the right move, I think that's an understandable thing. But once again, it's to our previous conversation on that topic. It has to be proven that it's a crisis, and that implementation has to be fair in a sense.
Sure, so let's work together to get a working definition of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the topic of working together, I would like to point out to you that during our majority government, every single piece of legislation we put forward, with the exception of our budget, had some level of opposition support. So you talk about that we don't know what compromise is. Meanwhile, the opposition has tended to support the NDP when we're in government.
Well, the opposition surely did not reflect that when you tried to push through amendment to kick Turkey out of NATO.
Yeah, because no one
There was no
campaigned on that.
opposition
We gave
support
that
to
as a
that,
free
and there
vote.
were. Yeah, but you still proposed it as government policy, even though two of the three parties in the government didn't support it, and even not the there was dissent in the NDP that proposed it.
Because we allowed a free vote. We said we haven't campaigned on this or formalized anything. So vote your conscience, vote your opinion. And now we've come together as a party and agreed that Turkey should be removed from NATO.
Okay, and we can debate the merits of that at a later date, because
we
that is
did
still
here
incredibly.
tonight, and you chose to keep. You want him in, I want him out. That's the difference right there.
And we can continue to argue about why kicking them out is irresponsible. But I think that goes beyond the scope of the question, so I'll hand it back to Ms. Ross.
Mr. Collin, anything to add?
I've got some general things I can. Other than that, no.
Okay, then we are going to move on to closing statements. As per the earlier coin toss, Mr. Collin, you have the first closing statement. You have 1 minute. Go.
Well, to copy my first national debate, it's the words of Jack Layton. People, loving.
You're cutting out.
Am I? Sorry. Give me 1 second. Let me unplug my mic.
It's okay.
All right. Apologies for that. Can you hear me now?
Much better.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay.
All right.
1 minute.
This election, it's a choice between moving forwards or backwards. The NDP stands to move forwards, and the Conservatives stand to move backwards. We want to move forward and expand healthcare. We want to move forward and protect our environment even more than we already have, and start to do that more internationally. We want to move forward on creating an economy that works for everybody, not just the rich and powerful. We want to move forward and transform education to be a right where everyone gets it, regardless of what their parents' income is. It should be free of cost. And we want to lower the cost of living through wise spending, not through some ill-defined, no actual value tax cut, because they can't even tell you how much they're cutting the tax by. So once again, this election is forwards, not backwards. Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Flynn, you have the last closing statement. 1 minute. Go.
Okay, so since a lot of the questions have been on the specifics of our policy, I'd like to bring us back to the big picture. And I think that although Mr. Cullen claimed that we're moving backwards on healthcare and the environment and many other policy areas, if he actually looked through our platform, he would find that we directly address them, and we address them better than he does, because we don't continue irresponsible tax and spend policies that. However, our main goal as government is to provide stable and also sustainable leadership to this country through a recession. So only our plan will put dollars back in Canadians' pockets, and that is the bottom line that matters the most in today's debate, and that is why our plan has been proven to be the most effective. Because we consistently stand with Canadians against an overzealous, over-ideological government, we allow Canadians the freedom
Mr.
to
Flynn?
make decisions for themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. I have been Florence Ross, and I am signing off.